Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from commenter Jesper P. Jesper P would like a video about the relationship between Gimli and Legolas, kind of from beginning to end, watching it grow. Awesome topic idea. We're going to do that today. I'm also going to add in a little subtopic that was asked by Poppin, which relates to Gimli and Legolas, so it seems like a perfect fit for this video. And I will do that probably more toward the end of the video. All right, so Gimli and Legolas. It's really, perhaps you could say, the signature relationship of Lord of the Rings is Sam and Frodo, but I would argue perhaps that the Legolas-Gimli relationship is perhaps the actual defining relationship of the Lord of the Rings. Partially because they begin as enemies and end as dear, dear friends. You know, Sam and Frodo are already buddies. They know each other. You know, they're partial to each other to begin with, and obviously their bond increases and they become strong friends. But it's the elves and dwarves. It's the racial thing. It's the fact that they start so opposed to each other and grow in this appreciation for each other that really does tell this heartwarming part of what Tolkien is trying to say is what defeats evil is this coming together of people who supposedly on paper are supposed to hate each other. Dwarves and elves obviously have had in Tolkien's world a rough, rocky relationship. I've done a video on why dwarves and elves don't get along. Just briefly, there's a lot of different events through Middle-earth history that have led to this, but the main one is back in the First Age, there was the Elven King Thingol. He hires some dwarves to put one of the Silmarils, you know, one of the most powerful gems in Tolkien's mythology. I'm going to come back to those as well later, but in any case, he puts a Silmaril on this necklace, the Nauglamir, just like a dwarven necklace with all kinds of gems of its own. It's like combine the two of them is like, the most amazing piece of jewelry of all time. The dwarves make this item, but then they become, I don't say corrupted, but they become entranced by the Silmaril gem, and they're like, we want the gem, and then there's a fight, and then they kill Thingol, and then the dwarves get killed, and then the dwarves come and sack Thingol's realm, and then those dwarves get killed. And anyway, there's a whole people blaming everyone else, and elves and dwarves don't get along kind of from then on, with some exceptions. Obviously, like at Moria, back in the day, you had the elves that lived nearby, Celebrimbor and his folk in Holland, and they would, hey, they were smiths, so they enjoyed the mithril that came out of Moria. They carved the door together with the dwarves, so they got along. There are little bits where dwarves and elves get along, but usually it's more of a mutually beneficial thing, like, oh, great, you have a resource I need. We'll get along for that. And so for the most part, they don't get along. And so here we are at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. When we see Legolas and Gimli meet is at the Council of Elrond. I thought it might be beneficial to kind of establish why each of them is at the council. So from the dwarves' standpoint, the dwarves are at the council because an emissary of Sauron, and we can guess it's almost certainly one of the Black Riders. Perhaps it's Camul the Easterling, but in any case, it's one of these Black Riders, has shown up to threaten, coerce, pretend to be nice, but actually really threaten the dwarves to give information about Bilbo. This is, Sauron and his company have tortured Gollum, and they know about Baggins and the Shire, and now they're trying to figure out a little more detail on this. And so they know that Bilbo went on this journey with these dwarves back in The Hobbit. And so they're going, hey, do you guys know of like a hobbit where he's a thief and we think he stole this little ring? The ring doesn't mean anything. It's not that big a deal, really. But by the way, we're going to give you 3 dwarven rings that we've got from your ancestors and complete access to Moria. But no, again, this ring doesn't mean anything. It's just like, sentimental value to Sauron. And so the dwarves obviously know something's up. They're like, ugh. And they rebuke this emissary 2 times, and the emissary's like, if I come back the 3rd time and you say you're not helping me, get ready, because you are now considered an enemy of Sauron. So Glóin is sent to talk to Elrond and basically to warn Bilbo. Bilbo is at Rivendell, and it's basically Glóin's mission to say, hey, we just want to warn you, by the way, Dark Lord is pretty close to figuring out who you are, and your days in that situation would be numbered, FYI. And so it's really cool because it really does harken all the way back to The Hobbit and the events of The Hobbit that are why Glóin is there. And Glóin is Gimli's dad, and so he brings Gimli with him, and that's why the 2 of them are there. As for why Legolas is there, I'm going to read a passage from the Council of Elrond because it establishes why Legolas is there, but it also has an interesting note as to why there might be enmity between Legolas and Gimli as well. So here we go. Legolas talking to the council. "Alas, alas!" cried Legolas, and in his fair elvish face there was great distress. "The tidings that I was sent to bring must now be told. They are not good, but only here have I learned how evil they may seem to this company. Sméagol, who is now called Gollum, has escaped." "Escaped!" cried Aragorn. "That is ill news indeed. We shall all rue it bitterly, I fear. How came the folk of Thranduil to fail in their trust?" "Not through lack of watchfulness," said Legolas, "but perhaps through over-kindliness. We guarded this creature day and night at Gandalf's bidding, but Gandalf bade us hope still for his cure, and we had not the heart to keep him ever in dungeons under the earth, where he would fall back into his old black thoughts." "You were less tender to me," said Glóin, with a flash of eyes as old memories were stirred of his imprisonment in the deep places of the Elven King's halls. "Now come," said Gandalf, "pray do not interrupt, my good Glóin. There was a regrettable misunderstanding, long set right. If all the grievances that stand between elves and dwarves are to be brought up here, we may as well abandon this council." Glóin rose and bowed, and Legolas continued. All right, so Legolas was put in charge of, or well, not Legolas per se, but the Wood Elves were in charge of imprisoning Gollum after he had been caught by Aragorn and interrogated by Gandalf. And so Gollum escapes with the help of some orcs. And Legolas has come to say, give that news. Hey, by the way, oops, Gollum's on the run. So in other words, like another threat to Bilbo. It's like everybody's showing up to go, by the way, Bilbo, you're in real trouble. Okay, great. But note that little bit there where in the middle of this thing, like, hey, look, Gandalf told us we should try to, this Gollum was redeemable, and we're trying to cure him, and we couldn't just keep him in dungeons. What they ended up doing was they took him out into they let him climb a particular tree once a day or something, and during one of those outings, the orcs attack. The dorks attack. The Dork Lords attacked. No! Orcs attacked, and by the time the orcs were defeated, Gollum had disappeared from the tree. But, point being, Glóin, somewhat rightly, points out, oh, so you were nice to Gollum. Oh, great, this evil, twisted creature. Oh, can't keep that guy in prison, but you kept me in jail, and so he's remembering the fact that, Legolas's dad, Thranduil, imprisoned Glóin back during the events of The Hobbit. And that is not easily forgotten. So right away you've got this enmity between the dads of Legolas and Gimli. They would obviously, just by their own families, not like each other. So they each obviously become part of the Fellowship, Legolas, Gimli, and they set out, and for the first part of the journey, they're still basically at odds. We don't see a lot of them bickering that much, but they're also not, hey, we're awesome friends. We do see them bicker at one point outside the gates of Moria. They're trying to figure out how to get in, say the "speak, friend, and enter," and they're kind of recounting the fact that elves and dwarves once got along in this one little region around Moria. And so here's the passage where they both kind of point some fingers at each other. "Those were happier days, when there was still close friendship at times between folk of different race, even between dwarves and elves. It was not the fault of the dwarves that the friendship waned," said Gimli. "I have not heard that it was the fault of the elves," said Legolas. "I have heard both," said Gandalf, "and I will not give judgment now. But I beg you to, Legolas and Gimli, at least to be friends and to help me. I need you both." So there it is, this moment. I think this is the moment when it's Gandalf that kind of like, "Hey, guys, look, I need you. I need your skills. And more than that, I think I need elves and dwarves to work in harmony with each other. And I need you two to at least be friends." And I think that's where both of them take this incredibly wise individual to heart and start thinking like, okay, well, maybe I should, make myself a little vulnerable to this other person that's in this fellowship. So shortly after the events of Moria, obviously, the fellowship goes to Lothlorien, and this is where Gimli meets up with Galadriel, and we see more of this accepting this racial enemy in friendship. In fact, Gimli's nickname is Gimli Elf Friend, because it's so unusual for a dwarf to, be friends with elves. And specifically with the Galadriel moment, Galadriel is giving gifts, to the various members of the Fellowship. She comes to Gimli, says, "What can I give you?" She's not sure what to give a dwarf. And he says nothing. I don't need anything from you. And she kind of insists, "No, you're not going to be the only member of the Fellowship that I didn't give something to." It's a bad example. So he says, "Okay, fine. I would love a lock of your hair." She's kind of taken aback by this. And so she asks him, what would you do with my hair? And he says, "Treasure it, lady, in memory of your words to me at our first meeting. And if ever I return to the smithies of my home, I shall set it in imperishable crystal to be an heirloom to my house and a pledge of goodwill between the mountain and the wood until the end of days." Okay, now this is interesting on a lot of different levels. I'm going to get a little nerdy here and leap back in time for a second. But so he's asking for a strand of her hair. Importantly, she ends up giving him 3 strands of her hair after asking him, "Why are you going to do this?" And his answer is, "Look, I want to keep this as a symbol of the friendship between elves and dwarves, and I'm going to put it in this crystal, and then it'll become this almost like a holy relic for the dwarves." It's very fascinating because what we know from I believe it's the Unfinished Tales, this scenario has already happened to Galadriel in the past. And this is before the First Age even, so way back in the day. Fëanor, I haven't done a video on Fëanor yet. I got to do a Fëanor video. He is an incredibly important character in Tolkien mythology. But Fëanor is, you can make an argument he's like the most amazing elf of all time, and that he's also the worst elf of all time. But undeniably, he's the greatest elven smith of all time, and he's the one that crafted the Silmaril gems. I mentioned I was going to come back to the Silmarils. Well, I am. Fëanor made the 3 Silmarils, and they captured the light from the trees of Valinor. At one point, the world was lit by the light from these 2 trees, and the light was captured in the Silmaril gems. Well, the idea that he got to place the light in a vessel actually comes from Galadriel, most likely, in that her hair was said to have trapped the light from the trees itself. So, caught in her tresses were like enmeshed in them was the light of the trees of the Valar. And Fëanor was so entranced by the light in her hair that he asked 3 times for a strand of her hair, and each time she rejected him. And it says actually in the Unfinished Tales that thereafter, it said they were unfriends for the rest of days or something. So this is the very first, Middle Earth Facebook. They unfriended each other way back in the day because Galadriel could see something about this guy. He was flawed. Even at this time when he was just riding high and basically this legendary hero that everybody loved, she didn't buy it. And he was kind of creepy, asking her for hair, like her hair, and like his motives seemed less than honorable. And she was like, "No, I'm not giving you my hair, boo." And so flash forward all these ages later, and she kind of puts it to Gimli to say, "Look, tell me, what do you want?" And he's like, "Oh, well, okay, a lock of your hair." And then she asks why, right? She's immediately like, "Why do you want my hair?" And he's not, because I'm creepy. I mean, his point is, I want this symbol of beauty to be this token of the relationship, the new forging of an alliance between the elves and dwarves. And interestingly, her response to his comment, so he's just said, "I'm going to put it in a crystal," which, by the way, I'm going to put it in a crystal. Sounds very much like the Silmarils. So it's a parallel to Fëanor taking that idea and creating the Silmaril gems. And here's the guy I'm going to take a gem and take your hair, the light of your hair, and put it into this gem. But so right after he says, "Here's why I want this hair," and she of course gives him the 3 strands, she says these words, which I think are exactly a parallel back to what had happened with Fëanor. She says, "None have ever made to me a request so bold and yet so courteous." So we know somebody made the request that bold, but not that courteous. And then she says, "But if hope should not fail, then I say to you, Gimli, son of Glóin, that your hands shall flow with gold, and yet over you gold shall have no dominion." And so I think what she's saying there is, she's reading into his heart and seeing that he does not have that same sense of greed that Fëanor had. Fëanor had a few different flaws. Pride was probably his greatest flaw, but greed was also a flaw of his. He wanted to hold on to those Silmarils. He wanted the power that the Silmaril gems gave him. And so she saw that the greed and the pride inside Fëanor was going to cause some problems, and it did. There's elves killing elves, and it's a bad scene. Eventually. But in the case of Gimli, here's this dwarf that she sees as actually of higher moral fiber than this ancient elven hero that she rebuffed all those years ago. I think that's a really telling moment in this mythology. And it's also interesting that, I'll flash forward for a second here. At the end of all this, when Gimli and Legolas set off on a boat together to go to the west. Gimli's the first dwarf, only dwarf ever to be allowed to go to the Undying Lands. It's not Legolas that really is allowed to give him permission, but Galadriel can give him permission. And so it's this moment is what allows Gimli to join Legolas in the Undying Lands, because he's basically got the official permission from Galadriel to come west. Okay, so we've gotten through Lothlorien. Of course, then there's the, they have their little competition. How many orcs can you kill? And it's Gimli that ends up, I believe, winning 42-41. So if you can out-kill Legolas in a battle, good on you, sir. And then it's after the Battle of Helm's Deep, where Gimli was forced into the glittering caves, the caves behind Helm's Deep. He has almost like a religious experience. And he goes through, actually, the quote is too long to read in its entirety. I'm going to read you a little excerpt from it. But he very passionately describes the beauty of these caves. I think it goes on for pages, practically. It's it's some of Tolkien's prettiest prose, really, where he's just all inspired by the way the light bounces off the rocks and the water and just the sight to behold. And so it's also very informative to the relationship between Legolas and Gimli for what happens at the end of this passionate outburst from Gimli. And I'll read this to you. All right. This is Gimli talking. Strange are the ways of men, Legolas. Here they have one of the marvels of the northern world. And what do they say of it? Caves, they say. Caves! Holes to fly in time of war, to store fodder in. My good Legolas, do you know that the caverns of Helm's Deep are vast and beautiful? There would be an endless pilgrimage of dwarves merely to gaze at them, if such things were known to be. Aye, indeed, they would pay pure gold for a brief glance. And I would give gold to be excused, said Legolas, and double to be let out of it, if I stayed in. You have not seen, so I forgive your jest, said Gimli, but you speak like a fool. Do you think those halls are fair where your king dwells under the hill in Mirkwood, and dwarves helped in their making long ago? They are but novels compared with caverns I have seen here. You move me, Gimli, said Legolas. I've never heard you speak like this before. Almost you make me regret that I have not seen these caves. Come, let us make this bargain. If we both return safe out of the perils that await us, we will journey for a while together. You shall visit Fangorn with me, and then I will come with you to see Helm's Deep. That would not be the way of return I should choose, said Gimli, but I will endure Fangorn if I have your promise to come back to the caves and share their wonders with me. You have my promise, said Legolas. And so there it is. This promise where they're allowing themselves to see past this war. They're finally seeing that maybe we might just survive this. And what do we do then? How do we find any sense of normalcy after this gigantic global disaster? And the way they do it is to share with each other. And so they do this. They don't just talk about it. This actually happens after the war. Gimli goes with Legolas to Fangorn, and Legolas goes with Gimli to the Glittering Caves, and they journey together. And in fact, Gimli ends up becoming the Lord of the Glittering Caves, and he sets up a Dwarven society there. And they don't mine it so much. I think there's a little bit of mining that goes on, but for the most part, they don't want to touch the beauty that is these caves. And so it's more of like that's their home and not this place that they just, hey, look at that! Woo, we got all the minerals out of it. Now we're good. No, they appreciate the natural beauty of it. And he is the Lord of the Caves for like over 100 years. It's when Aragorn dies, I think it's 120 of the Fourth Age. That's the year that basically the Fellowship ends, and Legolas builds a boat and invites Gimli, and Gimli has a lot to give up here. I mean, he's an old dwarf at this point, but he's not like imminently dying or anything, and he gives up being the Lord of the Glittering Caves. He gives up this amazing place that catches his breath every time he sees it, and forgoes kind of, the pleasures of Middle-earth for the sake of this friend of his, Legolas. And together they journey to the Undying Lands as this last act of the Fellowship in a way, right? It's like this, it's really, this touches your heart that, that these two individuals found this bond that lasted through this horrible, horrible war and, started something anew. I should mention, Gimli says, do you think those halls are fair where your king dwells under the hill in Mirkwood? And dwarves helped in their making long ago. So he's talking about Thranduil, the Elven King's halls, where his dad was imprisoned. And apparently, the dwarves actually helped to make that kingdom, and it is underground. So as much as Legolas, obviously as a woodland, favors the woodlands, he lived underground, at least, part of his childhood had to have been there. Here's an interesting point. We don't know how old Legolas is. That is not specifically stated. The best guess is that he was born around the beginning of the Third Age. So he's a few thousand years old. His dad was certainly born significantly earlier than that. But yeah, we don't know. The main reason people think that he wasn't born, say, earlier than the beginning of the Third Age is that his name doesn't show up in the War of the Last Alliance. That's the war that ends the Second Age. His dad's fighting in it. His granddad, I think, is killed in it. And there's no mention of Legolas being a part of this. And you think I would have mentioned it. If he was old enough to fight, he probably would have been fighting in that battle. So he's probably not old enough to fight at the time of the War of the Last Alliance. So people kind of just go, all right. And I think, in fact, like the official movie, guide says that he's born at the beginning of the Third Age. I don't think that's a Tolkien thing. It's a Peter Jackson thing, but it makes sense. So that's kind of that's how old, roughly, we think Legolas is. Now on to Poppin's question. Poppin asked an excellent question involving the true names of dwarves. And there's a language, the Dwarven language is Khuzdul, and they're very protective of it. Generally speaking, they don't teach a lot of people how to speak Dwarvish. There are folks that have learned Dwarvish. It's like either most people don't care to learn it, or the dwarves don't want to teach them. But by one method or another, there's not a whole lot of people outside of dwarves that speak Khuzdul. But one thing they are very secretive of is their actual names. All dwarves have true names, and they will not give them to outsiders. Very protective of these names. Almost like I don't know that it's ever said specifically in Tolkien's writings, but the implication is that they feel like it's almost a sense of their power. That if they give over this name, it's almost like, a demon's name, you can control it kind of thing. If you know a dwarf's true name, somehow you have power over that dwarf. And, hey, in a world where magic exists and, maybe that's not so crazy. Anyway, but point being, Poppin asked, did Gimli ever give his true name, his Khuzdul name, to Legolas? And I think the answer is no. I mean, they were good friends. They went to the Undying Lands together. But they weren't that good of friends. No, Tolkien never says what Gimli's true name is. So we don't know it, much less Legolas. It's never said that that name was spoken aloud ever. So I think Gimli was just known as Gimli and never gave that information up. On those information about the true names, dwarves don't even put the true names on their tombstones. Like that's how we're like, nope, even after death, I don't want my name getting out there. There's only a couple of dwarves that we know whose true names were revealed. There's a dwarven lord of Belegost who was killed by Glaurung, I believe. Injured Glaurung, but also was killed by him. I think I talk about him in my Glaurung video. But his true name apparently was Azargal. But also there was the petty dwarf Mim, who appears in the Turin Turambar myth. And there's an implication, Mim was apparently his true name, and he mentions his kids' true names. He's very casual about throwing out true names, and there's an implication that petty dwarves, one of the reasons they're petty dwarves are exiled from dwarven society, and perhaps one of the reasons they're exiled is because they're so casual with their true names. Don't say your Khuzdul name. Anyway, and so it's this big no-no, and the petty dwarves have been kind of shunned because of that. Perhaps that's the implication. So yeah, anyway, a little interesting little side note. Poppin, I hope that answers your question. And Jesper P, I hope this answers your question about kind of the stages of the relationship between Gimli and Legolas. Thanks so much, everybody. If you've got a topic you want me to talk about, feel free to put it in the comments like Jesper P did, and I will make a video about that topic. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.